His second-born son was a brilliant. Henry Cromwell would have kept it all together. Richard Cromwell, his firstborn, was an idiot. That's how he was known as Tumble-Down Dick. He couldn't hold it together in 1659. The Civil War and the restoration of Charles II, who'd been committing adultery right, left, and center in the capitals of Europe for the last 11 years, was hailed as the king and returned with great splendor and with a desire for vengeance upon the judges of his father. And it wasn't very long before lots of Republicans were rounded up and put in the Tower and then brought out for trial. And they included John Cooke, who was the prosecutor. They included Hugh Peters, one of the founders of Harvard University, or Harvard College, who'd come back to England as Cromwell's chaplain, as well as all the judges. And they were put up before Henry Bridgeman, who'd now become Chief Justice, in what was a totally rigged trial, in which not only the judges but the prosecutor and the lawyers were condemned to death. It was John Cooke put up a notable defense. He said he was the first to stand by the taxi rank principle, you know, the cab rank rule that barristers are only there to take a brief, whoever offers it. They don't, when they plead a cause, they don't necessarily believe in it. Well, the court rejected this defense. It said this was a great aggravation rather than a mitigation, and all the regicides were sentenced to the most horrible death that could be imagined. It was hanging, drawing, and quartering, in which the victim was strung up for a short time, not enough to lose consciousness, and then was cut down, and while they were still alive, their stomach was slit and their bowels were taken out and burnt in front of their eyes, so they would die in their own stench. And then the genitals were cut off and thrown to the dogs around the scaffold. It was the most appalling death. But the regicides, the first 9, including Cooke, died with enormous bravery. They made very fine, inspiring speeches from the scaffold. It was rather like in death penalty jurisdictions, the victim has a last dinner. In those days, the victim had one right to make a final speech from the scaffold, and their speeches from the scaffold were so inspiring that there was a real problem for the king. He had hundreds of Republicans, dangerous Republicans, still in his prison. The first 9 had been so courageous in their deaths that the crowd was starting to swing. The crowd that a few months before, the mob that had welcomed the king back, was now starting to swing against him and in favor of the regicides, thanks to their enormous courage. So he had a very brilliant Lord Chancellor, Lord Clarendon. And the king said, what are we to do? We can't keep on executing them because they're so courageous that the crowds will turn against me. And the Lord Clarendon said, I know what and we can't keep them in prison because habeas corpus still runs. And so we've got to give them a trial. And of course, if they're tried, they'd be sentenced to death. So what are we going to do? And Clarendon said, I know. He said, we'll put them on offshore islands where habeas corpus doesn't run. And this, believe it or not, was the precedent for Guantanamo Bay many centuries later. And it was regarded as devious even then. And when Parliament got its act together, it passed the 1679 Habeas Corpus Act, which applied habeas corpus to offshore islands. And in 2006, I think, when Hamden versus Rumsfeld was decided, it was Mr. Justice Stevens who had to remind Americans that that habeas corpus applied to offshore islands in 1679 when America was still part of Great Britain. So there it is. That's one resonance that we have today. But of course, the precedent of putting your head of state on trial for tyranny or war crimes was something that lodged in the public consciousness. It was very much studied, the transcript of the King's trial, when Louis XVI was put on trial in Parliament. And Louis's lawyers, he too had the best lawyers in France at the time, they advised him to use, as it were, the King's gambit to object to the jurisdiction of the court, which wasn't really a court, it was the National Assembly. Louis was determined to prove his innocence of the charges, which was a big mistake. He was convicted unanimously, 680 to 0 as the vote. But there was, of course, a very narrow split on whether he should be executed. I think that was about 340 to 330. It was incredibly close, and Tom Paine, who was an honorary deputy at the time, made a speech in English which had to be translated in favor of not executing Louis XVI, but rather sending him to America, where he might become a Republican and reform. But Saint-Just and Robespierre insisted that the tumbril be trotted out, which of course it was. When Britain had to decide what to do with Napoleon, they didn't go for a trial at all. They went for exile, and they simply stuck him on St. Helena till he died. There was a somewhat amusing, if macabre, reflection of this a few years ago when we were debating with the Americans what to do about Saddam Hussein when he was first captured and the court was set up. It wasn't clear from the Brenner administration whether the death penalty would be imposed, and there was a great fight between the English and the American lawyers as to whether Saddam should be subject to the death penalty. The Americans said to us, look, it's hopeless putting him, leaving him in Iraq. It would be absurd to have him in Iraq. We said, fine, we'll put him in Finland. No, he can't go to Finland. He's 100 family visitations under the Finnish prison policy, 140 cable TV channels, most of them showing pornography. So they can't possibly, we've got to have him executed. What do you say? What's your alternative? And we're a bit stumped, but I suggested that we should do what we'd done years before to Napoleon, and maybe put Saddam, if convicted, on St. Helena. And the British government actually took this seriously and the Foreign Office made some inquiries of this St. Helena. It was pointed out that the St. Helenans pointed out that they were trying to develop a tourist industry and an airport, and this was not appropriate. So I said, well, why don't we use the Falkland Islands and be very appropriate, I still think, for the likes of Milosevic and Saddam Hussein to spend the rest of their lives communing with penguins and never be heard of again. But that didn't come to pass, and you had the obscene photographs of Saddam being executed, and his place of rest has now become a pilgrimage spot. People are going to Tikrit much as they, and treating his grave much as they treated in memory that of Charles I. So I think we're going to hear more of the mistake of making Saddam a martyr.